There are moments in life that change everything without warning. One phone call can completely rewrite your future. One letter can reveal a secret that has been hidden for generations. I never imagined that losing my grandfather would also lead me into the biggest legal battle of my life. My name is Ethan Carter, and until a few weeks ago I lived a simple life in Dallas. I worked hard every day and rarely thought about the small valley where I grew up. Carter Valley was always a peaceful place filled with rolling green hills, open fields, and quiet mornings. It was where my grandfather spent almost his entire life raising cattle, fixing fences, and teaching me what it meant to keep your word. As a kid, I believed that valley would always be there waiting for me. But as I grew older, life became busy. College came first. Then work. Years passed without me realizing how long it had been since I had driven those dusty roads, or watched the sunrise over the hills. When my grandfather passed away, I felt like I had lost the last connection to my childhood. I drove back to the ranch for the funeral, expecting nothing more than a chance to say goodbye and help settle a few family matters before returning to Dallas. The funeral was quiet. Friends, neighbors, and old ranchers filled the small country church. Everyone had a story about my grandfather. They spoke about his honesty, his patience, and the way he always helped anyone who needed it without expecting anything in return. After the service, the family gathered inside the old ranch house. Everything looked exactly the way I remembered. The wooden floors creaked beneath every step. The smell of aged pines still filled the rooms. Family photographs covered the walls, reminding me of birthdays, holidays, and long summer afternoons spent riding horses across the valley. I honestly believed the hardest part of the week was already behind me. I was wrong. The following morning, my grandfather's attorney arrived carrying a thick leather briefcase. He greeted everyone politely before asking me to sit at the dining table. He opened several folders and placed a sealed envelope in front of me. Inside was my grandfather's final will. As I slowly read through the pages, my hands became still. According to his wishes, I had inherited Carter Valley. Not part of it. Not the ranch house alone. The entire property. 2,500 acres of land. The attorney explained that my grandfather had carefully updated every legal document over the years to make sure ownership would transfer directly to me. I remember looking out the kitchen window toward the endless fields, trying to understand what I had just inherited. The valley was more than land. It was history. It was family. It was responsibility. Before leaving, the attorney handed me another envelope. This one was different. There were no legal papers inside. Only a handwritten letter. I immediately recognized my grandfather's handwriting. Every letter, every word, and every sentence looked exactly the way I remembered from the birthday cards he used to send me every year. The letter spoke about family. It spoke about hard work. It spoke about protecting what matters even when nobody else understands why. Then I reached the final paragraph. Protect this valley, Ethan. One day someone will try to take it from you. Do not let fear decide your future. Trust the truth. Trust the law. And never forget where you came from. I read those words 3 times. At first they made no sense. Who would ever try to take an entire valley? The property had belonged to our family for generations. Every fence, every pasture, every stream, and every hill had always been part of Carter Valley. I folded the letter and placed it inside my jacket pocket. For the rest of the afternoon I walked around the ranch. The old barn still stood proudly near the western pasture. The windmill slowly turned above the water tank. The horses grazed peacefully behind the white wooden fence. Everything looked exactly the way it had when I was a boy. It felt impossible that anything could threaten this place. The next morning I decided to drive around the entire property before returning to Dallas. I wanted one final look at the land before deciding what to do next. The drive started exactly as I expected. Green fields stretched across the horizon. Large oak trees lined the dirt roads. The morning sun painted the hills with soft, golden light. For the first 30 minutes I smiled almost the entire time. Then I reached the northern ridge. I slowly drove over the hill, expecting to see another open pasture. Instead, I slammed on the brakes. In front of me stood something I never imagined could exist inside Carter Valley. Rows of beautiful suburban homes stretched across the landscape. Freshly paved streets curved between perfectly trimmed lawns. Decorative streetlights lined the sidewalks. Luxury houses stood where open cattle fields used to be. Children played in parks. Families walked their dogs. Expensive cars filled wide driveways. For several long seconds I simply stared through the windshield, unable to understand what I was seeing. Then my eyes landed on a massive stone entrance sign. Silver Creek Homeowners Association. That was the moment everything changed. I parked my truck on the side of the road and stepped out into the morning air. The valley was silent except for the distant sound of lawn mowers and birds singing from the nearby trees. For a moment I wondered if I had somehow taken the wrong road. I looked around searching for a familiar landmark that would tell me I was somewhere else. But everything around me confirmed the truth. This was Carter Valley. The land beneath those expensive homes had belonged to my family for generations. I walked toward the large stone entrance sign. The words Silver Creek Homeowners Association were carved into polished granite surrounded by flowers and carefully trimmed bushes. It looked like the entrance to one of the most exclusive communities in the county. None of it made sense. My grandfather had never mentioned a neighborhood being built here. He never talked about selling any part of the ranch. He had always spoken about protecting the valley. I reached into my truck and grabbed the folder containing the inheritance documents. Inside was the official county survey showing every boundary line of Carter Valley. I unfolded the large map across the hood of my truck and carefully compared it with the landscape in front of me. The road I was standing on appeared directly on the survey. The stream crossing the eastern side matched perfectly. The old oak tree near the entrance was marked on the map exactly where it stood. There was no mistake. According to every official record, the neighborhood was built inside property that legally belonged to my family. As I stood there trying to process everything, a white SUV slowly pulled up beside me. The driver's door opened and a woman stepped out with complete confidence. She looked to be in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a bright red business suit. She carried a clipboard under one arm and walked toward me like someone who expected every person she met to follow her instructions. "Good morning," she said with a polite smile that disappeared almost immediately. "Can I help you?" I introduced myself and explained that I had recently inherited Carter Valley from my grandfather. The moment I mentioned my last name, her expression changed. She looked at me for several seconds before crossing her arms. "My name is Linda Harper," she said. "I am the president of the Silver Creek Homeowners Association. This is private community property. May I ask why you are standing here taking photographs?" I calmly explained that I believed this land was included in my family's property according to the official county records. She laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not a surprised laugh. A confident laugh. She shook her head as though I had just told the world's funniest joke. "Mr. Carter," she said, "this neighborhood has been here for years. Hundreds of families live here. Everything you see belongs to the association. If someone gave you incorrect paperwork, you should probably speak with your attorney." I unfolded the survey map and pointed toward the property lines. "According to this map," I said, "your entrance sign, your roads, and a large part of this subdivision are inside Carter Valley." Linda barely glanced at the document. She looked directly at me instead. "Maps can be outdated," she replied. "What matters is who controls the property today." That answer immediately caught my attention. She never claimed the map was wrong. She never showed me another survey. She simply avoided discussing the legal boundaries altogether. Before I could ask another question, 2 more vehicles arrived. Several men and women wearing HOA board badges joined Linda near the entrance. Each of them watched me carefully. One of the men quietly asked Linda if everything was all right. She smiled and assured him everything was under control. Then she turned back toward me. "Mr. Carter, I am going to ask you one final time to leave community property. If you refuse, we may have to report unauthorized activity." Her words were calm, but the message was clear. She expected me to become angry. She expected me to argue. Instead, I smiled politely. I folded my survey map, placed it back inside the folder, and thanked her for speaking with me. That seemed to confuse her. Most people probably reacted emotionally whenever she challenged them. I had no intention of giving her that satisfaction. As I walked back toward my truck, I noticed several homeowners watching from their front porches. Some looked curious. Others looked concerned. One elderly man slowly nodded toward me as though he wanted to say something but decided against it. I climbed into my truck and sat quietly for several minutes. Then I took out my phone and searched the county property records website. Every digital map I found showed the exact same boundaries printed on the documents inside my folder. The legal lines had never changed. The neighborhood should never have extended this far into Carter Valley. One question continued repeating inside my mind. If the records were this clear, then how had an entire neighborhood been built here without anyone stopping it? There had to be an explanation. Maybe someone had made an honest mistake years ago. Maybe paperwork had been filed incorrectly. Or maybe something much bigger had happened. Either way, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer dealing with a simple misunderstanding. This was going to require evidence. Real evidence. Not opinions. Not arguments. Not assumptions. I started the truck and drove away from the neighborhood without looking back. My next destination was the county records office. If the truth existed anywhere, it would be waiting inside those archives. And for the first time since reading my grandfather's letter, I finally understood what he had been trying to tell me. Someone really had tried to take the valley. And I had a feeling this was only the beginning. The county records office sat inside an old brick building that looked like it had been standing there for more than 100 years. It was not a place most people visited unless they absolutely had to. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived. I grabbed my folder, climbed out of the truck, and walked toward the entrance, hoping the answers I needed were somewhere inside those walls. The building smelled like old paper, polished wood, and history. Shelves filled with thick record books stretched across the room, while rows of computers gave access to digital archives dating back decades. A woman behind the front desk smiled as I approached. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you today?" I introduced myself and explained that I had recently inherited Carter Valley. I asked if I could review every available document connected to the property, including deeds, surveys, tax records, and subdivision filings. She typed my family name into her computer. Within seconds, her eyebrows lifted slightly. "You have a very large file," she said. "Give me a few minutes." She disappeared through a heavy wooden door leading into the archive room. While I waited, I looked around the office. Framed maps of the county hung on the walls. Some were nearly a century old. Every map reminded me how much history was hidden beneath ordinary land. A few minutes later, the clerk returned, pushing a small cart loaded with thick binders and document boxes. I thanked her and carried everything to one of the large research tables near the windows. For the next several hours, I read every page I could find. The original Carter family deed was exactly as my grandfather had described it. The boundaries covered 2,500 acres. Every survey completed over the past 100 years showed the exact same property lines. Nothing had changed. Not once. I compared those records with newer county maps. Again, everything matched perfectly. The valley still legally belonged to my family. There was no document transferring ownership of the land beneath Silver Creek. No sale agreement. No boundary adjustment. No court order. Nothing. I leaned back in my chair, trying to understand how an entire neighborhood could exist without a legal transfer of property. The answer had to be hidden somewhere deeper inside the records. I continued searching. Then I found something interesting. Nearly 20 years earlier, a development company had submitted plans for a residential community near Carter Valley. The approved plans stopped hundreds of yards short of my family's land. I studied the drawings carefully. Those plans looked completely legal. The subdivision had originally been designed outside our property. So what happened? I requested every amendment connected to the project. The clerk searched the archive again before returning with another folder. Inside were engineering reports, environmental permits, and construction approvals. As I read each document, a pattern slowly became clear. The first phase of construction stayed within its approved boundaries. The second phase expanded slightly farther. Then another amendment appeared. Then another. Every few years the neighborhood quietly grew a little farther into Carter Valley. No single expansion looked dramatic. Each one seemed small by itself. But over 2 decades those small changes added up to hundreds of acres. Someone had slowly pushed the neighborhood deeper into my family's land. Almost nobody would notice unless they compared every survey from the beginning. I asked the clerk if anyone had ever questioned these changes. She hesitated for a moment before answering. There have been a few questions over the years, she admitted. Mostly from surveyors or neighboring property owners. But no formal ownership dispute was ever completed. That answer stayed with me. If nobody challenged the expansions, then they simply continued. Page after page confirmed the same story. The legal boundaries never moved. Only the neighborhood did. As the afternoon sun filled the room, I unfolded one final survey across the table. It had been prepared nearly 80 years earlier. The paper was faded and fragile, but every measurement remained perfectly readable. I placed the old survey beside the newest satellite image available through the county database. The comparison took my breath away. Where there were once open pastures, there were now paved streets. Where cattle once grazed, there were tennis courts. Where my grandfather had built fences, there were landscaped parks and walking trails. The transformation was impossible to ignore. I reached for my phone and quietly photographed every map, every survey, and every supporting document the county allowed me to copy. I wanted multiple backups. If this case ever reached a courtroom, I intended to be prepared. The clerk returned carrying several printed copies of the most important records. She placed them neatly into large folders before looking directly at me. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "if these documents are accurate, you may want to speak with an experienced property attorney before taking another step." I smiled politely. That was already becoming my plan. As I packed everything into 2 heavy boxes, my phone suddenly rang. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number. I answered. A calm, confident voice greeted me almost immediately. "Mr. Carter, this is Linda Harper from Silver Creek Homeowners Association. I understand you have been asking quite a few questions today." For a moment I looked around the records office. I had not told anyone outside this building where I was going. Yet somehow she already knew. I calmly replied that I was simply reviewing public records. There was a brief silence before she spoke again. "Some things are better left alone, Mr. Carter. Communities like ours depend on stability. Dragging everyone into a legal fight would become very expensive for you." I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I thanked her for the advice. Then I ended the call. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and picked up the document boxes. Her phone call had not frightened me. It had done something much more important. It confirmed that she was worried. And if she was worried, then I was getting closer to the truth. As I drove back toward Carter Valley, the sun was beginning to set behind the hills. The 2 boxes of records sat on the passenger seat beside me, and every mile I drove made one thing clearer. This was not a simple misunderstanding. Someone had spent years expanding Silver Creek deeper and deeper into land that never legally belonged to them. When I reached the ranch house, I carried the boxes inside and spread the documents across the dining table. Maps, deeds, tax records, construction permits, and survey reports covered nearly every inch of wood. I spent hours organizing everything by date, trying to build a complete timeline of what had happened. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Silver Creek had started as a small legal subdivision near the edge of Carter Valley. Then it slowly expanded. A road here. A park there. A few additional lots. A clubhouse. Tennis courts. Walking trails. Each expansion was small enough that most people would never question it. But together those expansions had consumed hundreds of acres. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the room. My grandfather's letter sat beside the oldest survey map. For the first time I understood why he had warned me. He must have seen this happening. Maybe he noticed the boundaries changing. Maybe he planned to fight it himself one day. Or maybe he hoped I would eventually finish the battle for him. Either way, I knew I could not handle this alone. I picked up my phone and searched for the best property attorney in the county. One name appeared repeatedly. Sarah Collins. She specialized in land disputes, ranch properties, and complex ownership cases. Her office was less than an hour away. I called immediately. A receptionist answered and asked for a brief explanation of my situation. I told her I had inherited 2,500 acres and discovered that an HOA appeared to be occupying part of the property without a recorded transfer of ownership. There was a short silence. Then she said Ms. Collins would like to see you tomorrow morning. The next day I loaded the evidence into my truck and drove to her office. Sarah Collins looked nothing like the dramatic lawyers people see in movies. She was calm, professional, and incredibly focused. After introductions, she asked me to start from the beginning. I told her about my grandfather's death, the inheritance, the valley, and the moment I discovered Silver Creek. Then I opened the boxes. For the next hour, she examined every document without interrupting. She compared the original deed to the modern surveys. She checked the tax records. She reviewed the subdivision filings and construction amendments. Finally, she removed her glasses and looked directly at me. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "if these records are accurate, your case is much stronger than I expected." My stomach tightened. That was the first time a legal professional had confirmed I was not imagining things. Sarah spread several maps across her conference table and pointed to the boundaries. "These lines never changed," she said. "The subdivision did." She explained that before filing anything in court we needed independent verification. Historical records were important, but a modern licensed survey would make the evidence much stronger. I agreed immediately. 2 days later, a professional land surveyor arrived at Carter Valley with GPS equipment and measuring tools. Together we spent the entire day walking the property. He located several original stone markers buried beneath grass and brush. Some were nearly forgotten, but they matched the old surveys perfectly. By late afternoon, he showed me the preliminary results. The legal boundaries of Carter Valley were almost exactly where the original deed said they were. Silver Creek had expanded far beyond them. When Sarah received the survey report, she began preparing a lawsuit. Ownership confirmation, boundary enforcement, legal recognition of the original property lines. Everything would be based on documented evidence. A week later, we filed the case in county court. That was when the entire town started paying attention. News spread through Silver Creek almost overnight. Homeowners who had never questioned the neighborhood boundaries suddenly began reading their closing documents and asking difficult questions. Some residents looked worried. Others looked angry. A few simply looked confused. Linda Harper responded by calling an emergency HOA meeting. According to several residents, she assured everyone that the association would win easily and that my claims were exaggerated. But people had started asking for proof. And proof was becoming very important. One evening I stood near the western pasture watching the sunset paint the valley gold. The wind moved through the grass exactly the way it had when I was a child. For the first time since this began, I felt strangely calm. I was not fighting because I hated the people living in Silver Creek. Most of them probably had no idea what had happened. I was fighting because the truth mattered. Because my grandfather trusted me to protect this valley. And because some things should not quietly disappear just because enough time has passed. A few days later, Sarah called with an update. The judge had scheduled the first hearing. The real battle was about to begin. The morning of the first court hearing arrived faster than I expected. I barely slept the night before. Not because I doubted the evidence, but because I knew this case was about much more than property lines. It was about my grandfather's legacy. It was about the truth. And it was about proving that no amount of influence could replace documented facts. Sarah met me outside the courthouse just before 8 in the morning. She carried several large binders filled with evidence while I carried the original Carter family deed inside a protective case. We walked through the courthouse doors together without saying much. There was no need. We both understood what was waiting for us. The hallway outside the courtroom was already crowded. Reporters stood near the entrance speaking quietly into cameras. Local residents filled the benches along the walls. Some homeowners from Silver Creek recognized me as I walked past. A few nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact completely. No one knew how the day would end. When the courtroom doors finally opened, everyone slowly found their seats. Judge Robert Hayes entered a few moments later. The room became completely silent. The judge reviewed both case files before asking Sarah to begin. She stood confidently and walked toward the center of the courtroom. Her voice remained calm and professional as she explained the history of Carter Valley. She presented the original deed signed more than 100 years earlier. Then she displayed every official survey completed over the decades. Each map confirmed the same boundaries. Each document supported the last. Nothing had changed. The land had always belonged to the Carter family. The judge carefully examined every exhibit. Then Sarah introduced the modern GPS survey completed only days earlier. Large display screens showed the original property lines beside the newest measurements. They matched almost perfectly. Even from where I was sitting, the evidence looked impossible to ignore. Linda Harper's attorney stood and thanked the judge before presenting the HOA's position. He argued that the neighborhood had existed peacefully for many years. He explained that hundreds of families purchased their homes believing the recorded subdivision was correct. He insisted that changing the boundaries now would create unnecessary hardship for innocent homeowners. Sarah never interrupted. She waited patiently until he finished. Then she stood once again. She made something very clear. This case was never about blaming homeowners. It was about determining who legally owned the land. Ownership could only be established through recorded deeds, official surveys, and verified county records. Not assumptions. Not tradition. Not convenience. The judge nodded thoughtfully. Next, the licensed surveyor entered the witness stand. He explained every step of his investigation. He described locating original stone markers buried beneath decades of grass. He explained how modern satellite positioning confirmed the exact boundaries established generations earlier. Every question received a direct professional answer. When the HOA attorney attempted to challenge his findings, the surveyor calmly referred back to the official measurements. His conclusions never changed. The evidence remained consistent. Sarah then introduced decades of county tax records. Year after year, the Carter family had paid taxes on the disputed land. No document showed those taxes being transferred to anyone else. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Several homeowners sitting behind Linda began whispering among themselves. I noticed one couple reviewing papers they had brought with them. They looked confused. Almost disappointed. As the afternoon continued, another witness took the stand. He had worked in the county planning office many years earlier. He explained how the original subdivision plans approved by the county remained outside Carter Valley. When shown later construction maps, he admitted the neighborhood appeared to have expanded well beyond those original plans. That testimony seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including Linda. For the first time since I met her, she looked genuinely nervous. She whispered several times to her attorney while flipping through documents. The confidence she displayed at the neighborhood entrance was beginning to disappear. Late that afternoon, the judge announced a short recess before closing arguments. Sarah and I stepped into the hallway. Neither of us celebrated. The case was not over. Anything could still happen. She looked at me and smiled. You trusted the evidence, she said. That was the right decision. When court resumed, Sarah delivered her final statement. She reminded the judge that every independent source pointed toward the same conclusion. Historical deeds, county records, tax documents, licensed surveys, original boundary markers. Every piece of evidence supported one another. She asked the court to recognize the lawful ownership of Carter Valley according to the recorded documents, and to restore the official property boundaries through the legal process. The courtroom became silent once again. Judge Hayes thanked both legal teams for their professionalism. He explained that the amount of evidence required careful review before a final ruling could be issued. He announced that the court would reconvene in several days for the official decision. His gavel struck the bench. The hearing was over. As people slowly left the courtroom, reporters hurried outside hoping to interview anyone involved in the case. I declined every request. There was nothing more to say. The evidence had spoken for itself. Now all that remained was the judge's decision. As Sarah and I walked toward the parking lot, she looked across the valley in the distance. "Whatever happens next," she said quietly, "we know the truth is finally on the record." I looked back toward the courthouse one last time before climbing into my truck. For the first time since discovering Silver Creek, I felt something I had not experienced in weeks. Hope. The next few days felt longer than the previous few weeks. Every morning I woke up expecting my phone to ring. Every afternoon I checked my email hoping for an update from Sarah. Every evening I walked through Carter Valley trying to clear my mind. The evidence was strong, but until the judge made his decision, nothing was certain. News about the case spread far beyond our county. Local newspapers covered the story almost every day. Television stations sent reporters to Silver Creek. People across the state began debating what should happen if a neighborhood had been built on land that legally belonged to someone else. Some people believed the homeowners should never lose their peace because they bought their homes in good faith. Others believed property rights had to be protected no matter how complicated the situation became. I understood both sides. The families living in Silver Creek were not my enemies. Most of them had trusted the paperwork they received when they purchased their homes. If anyone had failed them, it was the people responsible for making sure the development followed the law. One afternoon I received an unexpected knock on the front door of the ranch house. When I opened it, I found an elderly man standing on the porch. I recognized him immediately. He was one of the homeowners I had seen watching me during my first visit to Silver Creek. He introduced himself as Thomas. He apologized for arriving without calling first. Then he asked if we could talk. I invited him inside. We sat at the old wooden kitchen table where my grandfather and I had shared countless meals years before. Thomas looked around the room before speaking. He said he had lived in Silver Creek for nearly 15 years. He loved his home. He loved his neighbors. But after hearing the evidence presented in court, he started reviewing his own purchase documents. Something did not make sense. Several pages were missing from his closing file. The original survey attached to his paperwork showed only the first phase of the subdivision. The later expansion was barely mentioned. He looked at me with genuine concern. "I never wanted anyone's land," he said. "I thought everything was legal." I nodded. I believed him. I told him I never blamed the families living there. I only wanted the truth to be recognized. Before leaving, Thomas shook my hand. He promised to tell his neighbors exactly what he had learned. Over the next several days, more residents reached out. Some wanted answers. Others simply wanted reassurance that they would be treated fairly. I spoke with every person respectfully. I explained the same thing each time. This was not about revenge. This was about correcting something that should never have happened. Meanwhile, Sarah continued preparing for the final hearing. She reviewed every document one last time, making sure nothing had been overlooked. She warned me that the judge could ask additional questions before announcing a ruling. We would need to remain patient until the very end. Finally, the morning arrived. The courthouse looked even more crowded than before. News vans lined the parking lot. Camera crews waited near the entrance. Residents filled the sidewalks long before the doors opened. Inside the courtroom, every seat was occupied. Even the standing room along the walls disappeared within minutes. Judge Hayes entered exactly on time. The room became completely silent. He thanked both legal teams for their professionalism throughout the case. Then he began reading his written decision. He explained that the court had carefully reviewed every historical deed, every county survey, every tax record, every planning document, and every expert report submitted during the proceedings. He stated that ownership of real property must always be determined by verified legal records supported by credible evidence. The original Carter family deed had never been transferred. The historical property boundaries had never been lawfully changed. Independent surveying confirmed those boundaries with remarkable accuracy. County tax records showed continuous ownership by the Carter family. After reviewing all of the evidence, the court found that Carter Valley remained the lawful property of Ethan Carter. For several seconds, nobody moved. The courtroom was completely silent. Then I slowly looked towards Sarah. She smiled quietly. Not because we had defeated anyone, but because the truth had finally been recognized. Judge Hayes continued reading. He ordered the official property boundaries to be recognized according to the verified surveys. He instructed the county to update public records where necessary. He directed that any future actions would be carried out through the proper legal process with respect for everyone involved. The decision was clear. The law had spoken. As the hearing ended, people slowly stood from their seats. Some homeowners looked emotional. Others appeared relieved that the uncertainty was finally over. Linda Harper remained seated for several moments, staring silently at the documents in front of her. She no longer looked confident. She looked exhausted. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed toward us asking dozens of questions. Sarah answered only one. She simply said that today's decision reflected the importance of accurate public records and respect for the law. Then we walked down the courthouse steps together. The cool afternoon breeze moved across the square as I looked toward the distant hills of Carter Valley. For the first time since my grandfather's funeral, I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to disappear. The legal battle was over. But restoring the valley had only just begun. The days that followed the court's decision were unlike anything I had ever experienced. Carter Valley was peaceful again, but the work was far from over. A legal victory on paper was only the first step. Now the county had to put the court's decision into action. Early Monday morning I received a call from Sheriff Daniel Brooks. His voice was calm and professional as always. "Mr. Carter," he said, "the county has scheduled the implementation process. I would like you to meet us at the northern entrance of Silver Creek tomorrow morning. Everything will be handled according to the court order." I thanked him and agreed to meet. The next morning I drove toward the neighborhood just after sunrise. The same entrance sign that had shocked me weeks earlier stood quietly beside the road. This time, however, several county vehicles were already parked nearby. Survey crews unloaded their equipment, while county engineers reviewed large maps across the hood of a truck. Sheriff Brooks greeted me with a firm handshake. "Good morning, Ethan. Today is about following the court's instructions. Nothing more. Nothing less." His professionalism reminded me why the judge trusted him with enforcing the decision. Within an hour, licensed surveyors began locating every original property marker identified during the trial. Advanced GPS equipment confirmed each position within inches. Bright temporary flags appeared across the fields, marking the legal boundaries exactly as recorded in the original Carter family deed. Several homeowners gathered nearby watching quietly. Some looked nervous. Others simply wanted to understand what was happening. I walked over and introduced myself. Many of them recognized me immediately. A young couple approached first. The husband explained that they had moved into Silver Creek only 3 years earlier. They had saved for years before buying their first home. He admitted they were worried about what the future might bring. I understood their concern. I explained that I had never wanted families to lose their homes. The court's decision was about restoring legal ownership and correcting public records. The county would determine how every individual's situation would be handled under the law. They thanked me for speaking honestly. As the morning continued, more residents came over to ask questions. One elderly woman smiled warmly before saying something I will never forget. "Your grandfather used to wave every time he drove past this road. He was always kind. I think he would be proud of how you handled all of this." For a moment I could not answer. Hearing someone speak about my grandfather brought back memories of long summer afternoons repairing fences together. He always believed that respect accomplished far more than anger. I realized I had been trying to follow that lesson throughout this entire battle. Around noon, the county surveyors completed their measurements. Sheriff Brooks gathered everyone near the entrance. He carefully explained the next phase of the process. Official boundary records would be updated. Property owners would receive written notices explaining any changes affecting their land. Future decisions regarding roads, common areas, and community facilities would be handled according to state law and additional legal agreements where necessary. Everything would happen openly. Everything would happen legally. There would be no surprises. The crowd listened quietly. No one shouted. No one argued. Most people simply wanted clarity. Later that afternoon, Linda Harper arrived. She stepped out of her vehicle much differently than the first time we met. The confidence that once surrounded her had disappeared. She walked toward Sheriff Brooks carrying several folders before asking a few questions about the implementation schedule. When she finished, she turned toward me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. "I honestly believed we were protecting this community," she said. "Maybe somewhere along the way we stopped asking the right questions." Her voice sounded tired. There was no anger left. Only disappointment. I nodded respectfully. "This situation should have been resolved years ago," I replied. She quietly agreed. Without another word, she returned to her vehicle and drove away. Watching her leave, I realized something important. Winning in court had never been about humiliating another person. It had been about finding the truth. As the sun began setting behind the hills, the survey crews packed their equipment, and the county vehicles slowly left the valley. I remained standing near one of the original stone boundary markers. The same marker my grandfather had probably seen hundreds of times during his life. I brushed away a little dirt from the engraved surface and smiled. The valley was finally beginning to tell its true story again. For the first time in many years, every official record, every survey, and every legal document pointed in the same direction. Toward the truth. And that truth would remain long after all of us were gone. A few weeks passed, and for the first time since returning to Carter Valley, life began to slow down. The endless meetings with lawyers, surveyors, and county officials were finally coming to an end. The phones stopped ringing every hour. The television crews packed their equipment and moved on to the next story. The valley slowly became quiet again. Every morning I walked the property before sunrise. The air felt cleaner. The hills looked exactly the way I remembered from my childhood. The white fences stretched across the fields while the morning light covered the grass with a soft, golden glow. It reminded me why my grandfather loved this place so much. One afternoon, Sarah Collins drove out to the ranch carrying one final folder. Inside were the updated county records. Every legal description had been corrected. Every official map now reflected the original Carter Valley boundaries exactly as the court had ordered. She placed the folder on the kitchen table and smiled. "Congratulations, Ethan. This chapter is officially over." I looked down at the documents for several moments. For most people, they were simply pieces of paper. For me, they represented years of family history finally being protected. I thanked Sarah for everything she had done. Without her experience, patience, and professionalism, I knew the outcome might have been very different. She laughed softly. "You brought me the evidence," she replied. "The truth won this case. Not me." Before leaving, she looked across the valley one last time. "Take good care of this place," she said. "Your grandfather trusted the right person." As her car disappeared down the dirt road, I stood alone on the porch thinking about everything that had happened. Just a few months earlier, I had planned to return to Dallas after the funeral. Now I could not imagine leaving Carter Valley again. The valley felt like home. Not because I owned it. Because it carried my family's story. Over the following months, I began restoring parts of the ranch that had been neglected for years. The old barn received a new roof. Broken fences were repaired. The windmill was restored and started turning again for the first time in years. Neighbors from nearby ranches volunteered to help. Many of them had known my grandfather for decades. They shared stories I had never heard before. One rancher smiled as he pointed toward the western pasture. "Your grandfather planted those oak trees himself," he said. "He wanted future generations to enjoy the shade." Another neighbor laughed while remembering how my grandfather once spent an entire weekend helping repair a stranger's fence after a storm. Listening to those stories made me realize something important. A legacy is not measured by the amount of land someone owns. It is measured by the lives they touch. One Saturday morning, several families from Silver Creek arrived at the ranch. At first I was surprised. Then I noticed Thomas walking at the front of the group. He smiled as he stepped forward. "We wanted to thank you," he said. "Not because of the lawsuit. Because you treated everyone with respect even when things became difficult." Behind him, children carried small trees ready to be planted. One family brought homemade pies. Another brought gardening tools. Someone suggested planting a line of young oak trees near the entrance to the valley as a symbol of a new beginning. I thought it was a wonderful idea. Together we spent the afternoon digging holes, planting trees, and sharing stories. Children laughed while running across the open fields. Parents talked about the future. For the first time there was no tension between anyone. Only hope. As the sun began setting, Thomas walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me before looking across the valley. "Funny how life works," he said. "A few months ago most of us thought you were trying to take something away from us. Now we understand you were protecting something that should have been protected all along." I nodded quietly. Sometimes the truth takes time to reach people. But once it does, everything changes. That evening, after everyone left, I walked alone toward the highest hill overlooking Carter Valley. The young oak trees stood in perfect rows near the entrance. The ranch looked more alive than it had in years. I reached into my jacket pocket and unfolded my grandfather's handwritten letter one more time. The paper had become worn from being read so many times. I slowly read the final lines again. "Protect this valley, Ethan. Trust the truth. Trust the law. Never forget where you came from." This time those words no longer felt like a warning. They felt like a promise that had finally been fulfilled. I folded the letter carefully and looked across the land stretching toward the horizon. The valley was peaceful once again. Exactly the way my grandfather had always hoped it would be. The seasons slowly began to change across Carter Valley. The bright green fields of spring turned into the deep golden colors of late summer. Every sunrise reminded me that life keeps moving forward no matter how difficult yesterday may have been. Almost a year had passed since I first stood at the entrance of Silver Creek staring at that stone sign in complete disbelief. Sometimes it felt like a lifetime ago. Other times it felt like it had happened only yesterday. The valley had found its peace again. The county completed every remaining legal update exactly as ordered by the court. New property maps were recorded. Boundary markers became permanent. Every official document now reflected the truth that had existed all along. One afternoon, Sheriff Daniel Brooks stopped by the ranch while driving through the area. He climbed out of his truck with his usual calm smile. "Thought I would check on my favorite ranch owner," he joked. I laughed and invited him inside. We sat on the porch looking across the fields while drinking fresh coffee. "You know," he said after a long silence, "I have worked in this county for more than 20 years. Most property disputes end with neighbors refusing to speak to each other ever again. This one ended differently." I looked toward the distant hills. "I never wanted enemies," I replied. "I only wanted honesty." The sheriff nodded. "That is probably why things worked out the way they did." Before leaving, he stood near the porch steps and looked across the valley. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said quietly. Those words stayed with me long after his truck disappeared down the road. Over the following months, Carter Valley slowly became more active than it had been in years. Local schools asked permission to bring students for educational visits about ranching and land conservation. Agricultural groups held small community events on the property. Families from nearby towns visited during the fall harvest festival. The valley that once seemed divided had become a place where people gathered again. Even many residents from Silver Creek attended community events. The tension that once existed between us slowly disappeared. One Saturday afternoon, Thomas arrived carrying an old wooden box. He placed it on the porch table before smiling. "I found this while cleaning my attic," he said. "I think it belongs to you." Inside were several faded photographs. The first picture showed my grandfather standing beside the original ranch entrance nearly 40 years earlier. The second showed dozens of neighbors helping repair fences after a severe storm. The third photograph stopped me completely. It showed my grandfather shaking hands with Thomas when both of them were much younger. "You knew him that long?" Thomas smiled. "Long before Silver Creek existed. Your grandfather helped my family when we first moved here. He never expected anything in return. That was simply the kind of man he was." I carefully placed the photographs back inside the box. Every picture felt like another piece of family history returning home. Later that evening, I walked through the old barns searching for a safe place to keep them. While moving several old wooden crates, I discovered something unexpected. Behind a workbench sat my grandfather's original leather journal. Dust covered the worn cover, but the pages inside remained in excellent condition. I carried it outside and began reading. The journal contained years of handwritten notes about ranch work, weather conditions, and family memories. Then I reached an entry written nearly 20 years earlier. Today I noticed survey stakes near the northern pasture. Someone says a new neighborhood will be built nearby. I hope they remember where the property line belongs. Those words gave me chills. Several pages later, another entry appeared. More construction today. The workers crossed farther than expected. I reported it to the proper office. Hopefully someone corrects the mistake before it grows into something larger. I slowly closed the journal. My grandfather had seen the problem from the very beginning. He tried to protect the valley. He trusted that someone would eventually listen. Unfortunately, that never happened during his lifetime. Now I understood why his final letter carried so much urgency. He knew the responsibility would eventually become mine. That evening I placed the journal beside his handwritten letter inside a small wooden display case in the ranch house. Those two documents would remain together as a reminder that truth is worth protecting even when it takes years for others to see it. As darkness settled across Carter Valley, I stood outside beneath a sky filled with stars. The wind moved gently across the hills, carrying the same peaceful sound I remembered from childhood. Everything around me felt complete. Not because every problem had disappeared, but because justice had finally caught up with the truth. And sometimes that is enough. The following spring arrived with warm mornings, clear blue skies, and fresh green grass covering every hill in Carter Valley. Standing on the porch one morning, I realized it had been exactly 1 year since I inherited the ranch. 1 year since my grandfather's funeral. 1 year since I first discovered the Silver Creek neighborhood sitting where open pasture once stretched across the valley. Looking back, it almost felt unreal. I had arrived believing I was simply settling an inheritance. Instead, I found myself protecting more than a century of family history. I walked toward the highest hill carrying only my grandfather's letter in my jacket pocket. The same path that once felt heavy with uncertainty now felt peaceful. The young oak trees planted months earlier had already begun to grow. Their leaves moved gently in the morning breeze, reminding me that strong things often begin very small. As I reached the top of the hill, I stopped and looked across the valley. The white ranch fences followed the hills exactly as they had generations before. The restored barns stood proudly beside the pasture. Cattle grazed peacefully across the open fields. Children from nearby families laughed while fishing near the creek during a weekend community event. The valley was alive again. Not because of a court victory. Because people had chosen to move forward together. A truck slowly drove up the hill behind me. It was Thomas. He stepped out carrying 2 cups of coffee, just like he had done many times over the past year. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. I smiled. "Always." For several minutes neither of us spoke. Sometimes silence says more than words ever can. Finally Thomas looked across the valley. "You know, Ethan," he said, "most people spend their whole lives chasing money, bigger houses, or more land. But after everything that happened here, I think people learn something different." I looked toward the horizon, waiting for him to continue. He smiled. "The most valuable thing anyone can leave behind is trust. Your grandfather understood that. Now so do we." His words stayed with me long after he drove away. Later that afternoon, I opened the old ranch house for a small gathering. Neighbors, ranchers, county officials, and several families from Silver Creek came together for a simple picnic. There were no speeches. No formal ceremony. Just good food, honest conversations, and children running freely across the same fields where generations of my family had worked before them. Sheriff Brooks stopped by with his family. Sarah Collins came for a few hours before returning to the city. Even several county employees who helped update the property records joined us for lunch. Watching everyone laugh together, I realized something I had not understood when this journey began. Winning never came from defeating another person. Winning came from protecting the truth without losing your respect for others. As the afternoon turned into evening, I walked alone toward the old oak tree near the entrance of the ranch. I reached into my pocket and unfolded my grandfather's letter one final time. The paper had become soft from being carried almost every day. I read the last lines slowly. Protect this valley, Ethan. Trust the truth. Trust the law. Never forget where you came from. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a wooden frame that now hung above the fireplace in the ranch house. That was where it belonged. Not hidden inside a drawer. Not locked away in a safe. But displayed where every future generation of the Carter family could read it. As the sun disappeared behind the western hills, golden light covered the valley one last time. I smiled, knowing that my grandfather had been right. Land can be taken. Buildings can be replaced. Fences can be moved. But truth has a way of finding its way back home. Sometimes it takes months. Sometimes it takes years. But eventually the truth always stands where it belongs. If there is one lesson this journey taught me, it is that patience will always outlast intimidation. Honesty will always outlast deception. And respect for the law will always build a stronger future than fear ever could. Carter Valley was never just 2,500 acres of land. It was a promise passed from one generation to the next. And now that promise was mine to protect. Thank you for spending this journey with me. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we have many more incredible HOA stories coming your way. And before you leave, I would love to know something. Where are you watching from today? Leave your city and state in the comments below, because I read as many of your comments as I can. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of the people around you, and remember that doing the right thing is always worth it.